made a video a while ago talking about unethical gooners and how frustrating it is when people refuse to draw a line between fantasy and outright harmful content. Specifically, the way some gooners will justify consuming violent or exploitive sexual fiction with it's just fiction, as if that erases all responsibility for what they engage with. But some of the comments I got were people saying things like, who expects gooners to be ethical? The two things are opposites. Or, do ethical gooners even exist? Which, to make it sound a little more serious, translates to, are there people who get sexually aroused to things you can get morally sexually aroused to? Considering that there's a filter AI button on the Rule 34 site, I'd say so. I don't know if these comments were joking, but if anybody seriously thinks this way, I'd like to say that I disagree with that. There is obviously nothing wrong with being sexually aroused or getting off by itself. Well, unless your morality is rooted in the religious framework where premarital sexual pleasure is inherently shameful. Apparently, I offended a lot of religious people, I mean in more ways than one, because in my original video I said I sincerely don't think there's anything wrong with romanticizing consensual sex in media. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about religious vanilla breeding sex either. To put what I said into perspective, before I made that video, I looked up a bunch of academic sources that surrounded adult content, and in between the actual scientific testings and research, I kept seeing blogs begging God-fearing parents to not expose their children to ungodly sexual themes in media, specifically because it will plant the idea that having any sexual interaction outside of impregnation within a heterosexual marriage is bad, which I kept including screenshots of throughout that video. The point of that last line in my original video was to not say that sexual interaction within the context of trying for a baby within a straight marriage is bad, but rather that ungodly but still consent-fueled sexual interactions are just as fine as godly sexual interactions. But I'm sure religious people know that, considering that they're most famously known to not take things out of context and interpret everything correctly. I think that kind of mindset where certain usually religious people believe that sexual content is unethical without any leeway is one of the reasons why covering this topic is so difficult, since whenever you do hear any type of criticism of adult content, it's usually extremists saying you're gonna go to hell for just knowing that it exists. When people go through life from frameworks that categorically condemn all non-procreative sexual expression, it just seems like they can't develop the critical thinking skills needed to distinguish between healthy consensual content and genuinely exploitive material, which is how God-fearing people demonize works like Heartstopper because they think it's an ungodly gay despite it being a wholesome gay romance with the most explicit thing being kissing. This binary thinking is just what prevents ethical sexual content consumption, because instead of learning to evaluate whether content depicts mutual respect, whether it was ethically produced, or whether it reinforces harmful dynamics, people just get pushed into an all-or-nothing debate that treats every form of sexual content as equally problematic or unproblematic, even when there's an obvious difference between a safe consensual love story and fetishized violent sexual assaults. I have very mixed feelings surrounding any type of not safe for work content, since I believe that any type of content, fictional or otherwise, can be consumed ethically in very specific scenarios. For example, I think that most of us can agree that footage of a real-life child being forced into what should be adult sexual activities by a grown adult is horrible, but can be viewed ethically by it just being evidence of the perpetrator in committing those acts to a judge and jury in a courtroom. That obviously doesn't make the footage okay, but the consumers within that context are obviously not bad people. However, when it comes to fictional content, I find that the problem very rarely has to do with the content itself, because it usually has to do with certain people consuming or creating it. Within the context of unethical sexual fiction, people can use their imaginations to justify any interaction that would be unethical in real life, because they can mentally reframe whatever is happening with it being consensual. If every person did that and were educated on how consent actually works in reality, I think there would be no problem at all with taboo fiction, because then it's just kinks, not actually romanticizing harm itself. Except unfortunately not every person does that, so at that point it has to be up to the creator to reduce as much harm as they can, like making their message clear to not be misunderstood. But I can also understand that it's extremely hard to do that consistently. When it comes to taboo themes and content specifically made to be sexualized, I can recognize now that the suggestion of a genre change would most likely hardly matter, since I think most people don't bring in childlike characters into just because they want to bring up the important topic of CSA in fiction, period. Because in reality, when people specifically seek out content that sexualizes children, even fictional ones, they're probably not doing it for the deep storytelling potential. They're doing it because they're attracted to the idea of that specific theme in sexualized media. So if content like that is going to exist anyway, no matter what anybody says or does, I think one of the ways that would put more people at ease would be by making it so fantastical and exaggerated, like with weird proportions, surreal scenarios, that it's less comparable to real life situations. For example, when I was talking about unethical gooners, I brought up this manga of a 4th grader that desperately screams and cries for help while the old fat ugly man tells her to cry all she wants because no one is coming to help her. The reason why I find this content to be unethical should be obvious, but it's also because there are actual old fat ugly men who are attracted to elementary school girls, especially in Japan, considering that little girls aren't allowed to wear ponytails to some schools anymore because every single culture around SA victims is horrendous. But when I read it, I just couldn't help but get reminded of how horrible real life CSA is. But to be fair, I've also seen other adult content that's also extremely problematic, like this one where this Mormon suburban white woman runs outside naked as her gigantic breasts bounce boobishly past her, and she finds an adult man in a diaper in a baby basket. It is wildly offensive to probably everyone on earth, but because of how bizarre it is with its caricature-like art style, weird body proportions, and obviously strange scenario that seems like it's trying to be comedic, I just couldn't help but get reminded that can get really weird, because when I read it, I didn't see it as a reenactment of any specific sex offender's case. It was just simply weird. That psychological distance matters more than some people realize. There are certain studies that show that when fictional content closely mirrors real-life traumatic events, it can invoke feelings of discomfort, insensitivity, or even trauma in viewers, because the brain often processes realistic scenarios similarly to actual experiences, which leads to heightened emotional responses. When the piece of media is less likely to be related back to reality, then people are also less likely to get influenced by it. There were still a lot of elements of problematic things in the second example, but I still feel like psychological distance makes it read more like a parody of tropes than something that could be copied in real life. I don't think that makes this content good or excuses its problems, it just makes it feel less immediately dangerous, especially since the racist comic also had obvious disclaimers while the CSA example didn't. There are certain creators who don't want to change anything about the story, where it heavily involves problematic or taboo things, and I understand that, but I think it'd be at least helpful to have some more explicit disclaimers, like those very obvious warnings you see sometimes on certain games, videos, or comics, where they say all the characters in this work of fiction are over 18, or even this is a fantasy roleplay between consenting adults. I haven't seen that second one, but I'm sure someone's put it in their work. Kinda like how cigarette packages have to tell you that they're addictive and cause health issues. The warnings are there so people with certain vulnerabilities, like addictive personalities or certain health or mental health conditions, can make informed decisions about whether to interact with the product. But cigarettes aren't illegal to consume because ultimately it's just considered self-harm. So it's just society telling you that smoking is unhealthy, while legally there's no one stopping you from making that choice. As I've said before, I personally don't believe in censorship because the people who want to see it will see it through any means necessary. But we should still have clear warnings about addiction potential, what it can do to your brain, better age verifications, resources for people who want to stop, and education about what healthy sexuality and sexual interactions actually look like. That way people can make informed choices safely without harming anybody else. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing in my opinion. As much as it'd be nice for creators to convey their characters to enthusiastically consent to everything being done to them, some people just do simply have a fantasy, whether as the victim or the perpetrator. I still believe that content that sexualizes non-consensual acts is ethically problematic at its core. The fantastical lining doesn't change the fact that the underlying scenario being portrayed is still harmful. But if I were to consider the viewers individually, I can't see into people's minds to know how they're actually processing this content. Someone might be consuming it for completely different reasons than the non-consensual aspect that I've decided was too much for me. Like being drawn to the fantasy world building, the art style, the emotional complexity of the story, or even just mentally headcanon the portrayed scenarios to be consensual as they consume it. The content itself still remains ethically questionable regardless of the fantasy elements, but that doesn't mean every person who encounters it is automatically a bad person. It's just unfortunate that the bad people that exist are drawn to themes like this in fiction, which is what I think most people are worried about. Like how some research found that people who have problematic use typically have various mental and physical complaints following periods of heavy use, sexual functioning deficiencies with real partners, and a subjectively altered state of sexual arousal, which makes me believe that the way sexual content is consumed and what messages it sends about sexuality can have real psychological and physical effects on people's sexual lives. Again, that doesn't mean it's everyone, but it's enough that it's concerning. I've talked about No Mercy and how its defenders weird me out probably more than the actual contents of the game. To recap, No Mercy is a visual novel where the goal is to violently rape, blackmail, and beat women under the guise of punishment and domination, and then rewards you for it. The game got recently taken down from Steam due to the backlash, but people still heavily support this game. No Mercy obviously isn't the only simulator game out there, but it's the most popular that I've personally seen a lot of people publicly defend. And their defenses are typically just, oh, so we should just ban all video games, right? So we're just hating on indie video game developers now? God forbid people create visual novels that aren't real. The concerns never revolve around the actual contents of the video game because they either don't want to admit that they're into it, or they also personally don't like it but are scared that other content that aren't as problematic will get taken down too. I really resonate with the second excuse, but I still don't think that it means you should defend works of fiction without question just because you're scared of censorship. I think what would make this game easier to defend is if the developers had added a little segment with all the victimized characters either at the beginning as a bonus cut or at the end, where all the women are happy, smiling, and explaining that they're just playing and they all really did want those things to happen to them. That'd be easier to read as just BDSM fantasies with consenting participants instead of feeling like I'm looking into an average incel's daydream of women. The reason I suggest that is because in live action BDSM videos, there are segments usually at the end or beginning of the videos that have the people from the video smiling and talking to the camera, telling the audience that they had a fun time. This is partly because BDSM scenes can get so intense that it genuinely looks like the person is crying or actually not having a good time. I know in the context of video games, stories, and fictional media overall that it's obviously not necessary because everyone already knows that they're just fictional characters, but if you want to explore kinky dynamics like CNC or play, it would just really help push the importance of consent within BDSM content a lot stronger. It seems as though some people have a hard time exploring taboo fantasies safely because they confuse authentic feeling with actually dangerous. The whole foundation of BDSM is that you create intense, even extreme experiences while maintaining safety and consent. But that still requires knowledge and communication that a lot of people skip. For example, when people say they have a choking kink, proper kink play involves applying pressure to the sides of the neck where you can create that intense sensation without actually cutting off someone's airway. But people who don't understand BDSM safety will just grab someone's throat and press on their windpipe, which can literally kill them. And if their partner objects, they might say, "What? You said you were into choking. I choked you." But that's not what they actually mean within the context of BDSM. The same thing happens all the time with fantasies. When people say that they're into consensual non-consent or roleplay, they obviously don't actually want some random stranger to attack them behind a dumpster. They want the psychological thrill of resistance and domination within a controlled environment with someone they trust, with safe words, and with aftercare. The fantasy is about the power dynamic and intensity, not about actual violence or violation. It doesn't make you a bad person for being into the most extreme and risky kinks, but if you choose to participate or depict those kinks within a piece of fiction, you have to do it right. If you don't remember, there was some legal drama surrounding the author of Daddy's Little Toy. Daddy's Little Toy is an erotic... I hate saying this title. Daddy's Little Toy is an erotic novel centered around a very young female protagonist that's most often portrayed as extremely underage or just barely legal, who enters a relationship with an older man who assumes a dominant daddy role. The most notable thing in the story was that he's been sexualizing her since the young girl was 3 years old, and even criticized her growing body when she was hitting puberty. The story features taboo themes like power imbalances, control, manipulation, and certain sexual dynamics. I've heard the tone has been the thing that's been mostly criticized, since it seems like it's glorifying or romanticizing these dynamics, since the book really teeters on the line between consensual BDSM and abuse/grooming, which is mostly why even people who did enjoy the book have distanced themselves from it due to the blurred connection of the book's contents and the author's actual conduct. I personally agree that this book was written in bad faith. The author lied to her publishers, friends, and family about the contents of this book because she knew that this book would be declined to get published. But this book existing does not automatically make all books surrounding kinks or taboo subjects insensitive. A common book that gets compared to Daddy's Little Toy is Lolita because it ruffled very similar feathers, but since Lolita was meant to be a psychological horror, I think a better comparison is a book called The Original Sinners. It's an erotic book that both has BDSM and romance that are explored in a very similar light to Daddy's Little Toy, like power imbalances, age gaps, and trauma, but covers them in a much more respectable way. All the scenes involve safe words, boundaries, and aftercare, even when there's more explicit scenes. None of the dynamics are glossed over because the author puts so much emphasis on emotional depth, ethical tension, and self-awareness. The most problematic thing that I spotted was that the main character and the main love interest met when she was 15, and that there was a weird power dynamic at the beginning, but to be fair, the story also directly addresses it because it portrays it as ethically complicated and not just, ooh, a hot teenager. Plus, the story actually reflects on the characters, that it just makes it seem like they're actually in a story, and it's not just about shock value and titillation, unlike Daddy's Little Toy that just seems like a pure fetish book. In The Original Sinners, the main character, despite being younger and submissive, she's not dumb or infantilized. Her submission is a choice and not forced onto her just because she's the younger one. The entire book acknowledges the fantasy while still being able to ground it in realistic emotional stakes and ethical nuance. The characters are obviously flawed and traumatized, but the narrative at least calls it out, so you can sit and ask yourself if it's okay. That's what I believe responsible kink fiction does. It can be filthy, dark, taboo, but it has to be aware of what the message is outside of it just being smut. The difference might not be as obvious to people who just find age play or overall kinks in general to be gross, but the slight distinction still matters because it mirrors how the BDSM community approaches the intense fantasies in real life. The BDSM community puts so much emphasis on education, communication, and consent frameworks because what they want is to access those intense psychological and physical experiences while keeping everyone safe and respected. They understand that you can explore power dynamics, dominance, submission, and even scenarios that would be harmful in other contexts as long as that there's an underlying respect, negotiation, and awareness of what's actually actually happening. But when people try to recreate those fantasies without understanding the safety protocols, or even when media depicts them without that context, it can normalize genuinely harmful behavior instead of consensual kinks. Books like The Original Sinners could function like good BDSM education, where they show you the fantasy while also teaching you the framework for understanding why it works, what makes it ethical, and how to think critically about power dynamics. But pure fetish books skip all that context and just present the scenario that would be harmful without consent, without any of the emotional intelligence or ethical awareness that would help readers understand the difference between safe fantasy exploration and real-world harm. I know it's so annoying that I just don't understand that fiction will just be fiction, but my concerns surrounding sexual content that consistently portrays certain dynamics without any context about safety, consent, or the difference between fantasy and healthy real-life interactions are valid, especially when research shows that people get indirectly affected by when it creates scripts that guide sexual experiences. To fill any confusing gaps, sexual scripts are basically the mental frameworks people use to understand what sex is supposed to look like, how people are supposed to behave, and what's considered normal or desirable. The thing that makes this the most concerning is that adult sexual content is extremely addictive. When people consume, their brain gets flooded with dopamine and serotonin, creating a tolerance effect where they need increasingly frequent or extreme content to achieve the same high. This kind of addiction literally rewires the part of your brain that weakens decision-making and impulse control, while the reward-seeking parts of the brain becomes hyperactive, which creates the very common issue where problematic sexual scripts get reinforced specifically when people's judgment is most compromised because they just want the dopamine hit, but they receive it by also absorbing those sexual scripts without any critical filter. So not only does repeated exposure to certain dynamics shape how people think sex should work, but the addictive nature of the content also means people are often consuming it in a mental state where they're least equipped to recognize or resist harmful messaging. The topic of jorking material is still very sensitive, and considering I had people from both extremist ends send me what could be considered erotic love letters if I put some acoustic guitar music behind it while reading it, I feel very caught in the middle. Should I leave behind my morals around sexual assault and child exploitation just so that queer and kink creators can flourish? No, I don't think so. Should I give in to the idea that all premarital sex is caused by Satan testing you just so that maybe child exploitation and without consent gets taken seriously? No, absolutely not. Puritans will use any criticism of problematic sexual content to argue that all sexual content is harmful and should be banned. Actual predators will hide behind the "it's just fiction" to avoid accountability for genuinely harmful material. But neither of those extreme positions helps people navigate ethical consumption of sexual content, which requires the kind of nuanced thinking that can distinguish between responsible kink fiction and exploitation. I consider myself to be extremely sex positive, but sex positivity doesn't mean that you have to excuse every sexual instance. You can still have your limits, and I think you should have your limits, but if you can't tell the difference between someone expressing their sexuality in a healthy, consensual way and someone profiting off of trauma, coercion, or minors, that just seems negligent, which kind of ultimately undermines the goal of creating a culture where sexuality can be expressed safely and authentically. I still love queer creators, support and cheer on ethical, not safe for work artists, agree to disagree on what people get off to, and still say that this specific one crosses the line without being a hypocrite just because some people misunderstand what I stand for. When I consume queer creators' content, I'm not saying that I support both queer rights and queer wrongs. I'm supporting them because they're creating content that represents authentic sexual experiences, often for communities that have been marginalized or misrepresented. When I follow ethical, not safe for work artists, is because they're approaching sexuality with respect for consent, agency, and the well-being of everyone involved in creating and consuming their work. I promise you that I'm not actually trying to police anyone's gooning session or stand outside your bedroom window with a clipboard rating your fantasies. What you do in your private life is your business, and I genuinely don't care what gets you up as long as nobody's getting hurt. But it'd also be nice for people to consider themselves in that nobody getting hurt bracket too. When people joke about ethical gooning, they're not just talking about avoiding content that could harm others, but also consuming content in ways that don't harm your own relationship with sexuality, your ability to form healthy, intimate connections, or your mental well-being. I know not everyone cares about that, but it's just like the difference between drinking a margarita with a little umbrella made by a bartender and drinking in the local landfill to find expired cases of beer. Sure, both will get you drunk, but one approach shows that you actually give a shit about what you're putting in your body. You can still enjoy whatever weird shit you're into while also being a decent human being about it. Ethical consumption doesn't have to mean vanilla consumption. It can mean being intentional about your choices, supporting creators who treat sexuality with respect, avoiding and critiquing content that causes real harm, and maintaining enough self-awareness to recognize when your consumption patterns might be becoming problematic. But then again, I don't know. That is just me. Laters. You're being really dramatic.